Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, good morning everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Recarbonizing Row Crop Farms. My name is Julia Froik. I am the project coordinator here at the Partnership for Ag Resource Management, and will be hosting the webinar this morning. We are joined today by my colleague, Mark Adelsberger, Resource Management Specialist for the Partnership for Ag Resource Management, who will provide a brief introduction. I'm also pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Justin Mount, Natural Resource Specialist at the USDA Midwest Climate Hub. Before we begin, I will go over some brief logistics. Please make use of the question box on your screen to type questions for Justin during his presentation. I will moderate the questions during the last 10 to 15 minutes of the webinar after the presentation. You will receive an email in the next few days with the webinar recording and links to 2 webinar evaluations, one from PARM and one from the USDA. The recording will also be available on partnershipfarm.org and YouTube. By attending today's webinar, you are eligible for 1.5 CCA continuing education units, 1 for soil and water management and 0.5 for nutrient management. You must be present for the entire webinar to receive those points. If you submitted your CCA number at registration and are watching the webinar live, no further action is required to submit your CEUs. If you are watching this on demand at a later date, please be sure to watch the entire presentation through the GoToWebinar platform and not YouTube to receive credit. If you watch the webinar recording more than 2 weeks after the original broadcast, please email julia@partnershipfarm.org your CCA number to ensure your credits are submitted. Please make a big note that credits often take a few weeks to appear in your account. If it has been more than 4 weeks, please contact my email. And now, with the logistics taken care of, I will turn it over to Mark, Resource Management Specialist for the Partnership for Ag Resource Management.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks everyone for joining us today. The Partnership for Ag Resource Management, or PARM, is an effort of our nonprofit IPM Institute, along with many other projects in agriculture and communities, each focused on using the power of the marketplace to improve sustainability. Our team of 21 is currently working to increase adoption of best practices and improve outcomes in health, environment, and economics, all key elements of sustainability. IPM works with pest control companies, hospitals, schools, and other facilities in communities. We also work with food companies and farmers around the world to improve practices and performance and to communicate those benefits to buyers and the public. Our goal at PARM is to collaborate with ag retailers to identify and promote revenue-generating products and services that keep inputs on cropland. We track sales of these through annual surveys and calculate estimated nutrient loss reductions for several. We then provide an individual nutrient stewardship report to participating ag retailers that compares location info with state and basin-wide data. We post our aggregate survey reports on our website under the Ag Retailer tab. We work with retailers and industry associations to publicize survey results through press releases and articles. It's important to get the positive news out there to address misperceptions the public has about agriculture. We're all aware of the water quality challenges we face, from the record-breaking algal blooms in the western Lake Erie Basin to the expansive hypoxic zones in the Gulf of Mexico. Increased levels of phosphorus in the water feed algal bloom growth, which closes beaches to swimming, makes fishing a challenge, and has also shut down public water supplies. We know phosphorus runoff is coming primarily from cropland because of the timing of the loads. They spike during snowmelt and rain events in winter and early spring, following fall applications. The graph on the upper left-hand corner shows the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's annual data on algal bloom severity in the western Lake Erie Basin since 2002. We can see on average The algal blooms are becoming more frequent and severe, making it increasingly important to convey the economic and environmental benefits of products and services like cover crops and variable rate application that help retain nutrients on fields. Ag retailers we partner with in the Great Lakes and upper Mississippi River Basin states are working hard to improve water quality. Our annual survey shows substantial increase in several products and services that help keep inputs on cropland, including variable rate phosphorus application, which has increased from 17% of acres serviced in 2011 to 67% in 2017, with a slight decrease in 2018 to 53% within the Sandusky River watershed, where our project started in 2010. In 2015, through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the EPA's Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, we secured funding for ag retailers in the watershed to offer a discount on variable rate technology to farmers who had not used it before. 26 ag retailers and 343 growers have participated, implementing more than 26,500 VRT cost share acres to date. Using published estimates, which are variable based on factors including weather, soil type, and slope, serviced acres utilizing VRT in this graph kept more than 400,000 pounds of total phosphorus and over 1 million pounds of nitrogen from leaving cropland in the watershed. It is vital that we track and report these improvements retailers are making so the regulators and the public are aware of these voluntary efforts. PARM has also recently launched a cover crop incentive program for ag retailers in the Blue Earth River and Yahara River watersheds in Minnesota and Wisconsin. We are working to expand both VRT and cover crop programs moving forward. More information on this can be found on our website, partnershipfarm.org, under the Ag Retailer section. With that, I'd like to turn it back over to Julia. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Our team also provides free resources for ag retailer employees, grower clients, and consultants, available on our website, partnershipfarm.org. On the left is our continually updated and 4R approved agronomist handbook, available free for download. The handbook includes algal bloom updates, trends in customer product and service adoption, and fact sheets for your grower customers to increase awareness of products and services that reduce nutrient runoff. Our phosphorus loss reduction wallet cards are on the right and can be ordered for free on our website. These are a great conversation starter with your customers and can also serve as handouts in meetings. To date, we have distributed more than 28,000. Our next webinar will occur in early August on crop scouting for pests and diseases. Look for announcements in your email and on Facebook and Twitter. Our next webinar in the Great Lakes Conservation Connect series will air in early September and will cover next generation farming. And remember, we take into consideration your suggestions for webinar topics, so be sure to fill out our evaluation form after the webinar. We also invite you to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for PARM updates and industry news. Today's webinar is sponsored by Field to Market. We will now hear from Donnie Taylor from the Agricultural Retailers Association, who will provide a brief introduction to sustainability programming for ag retailers and CCAs, or SPARC. SPARC is a partnership between the Agricultural Retailers Association, the American Society of Agronomy, Environmental Defense Fund, and Field to Market.
Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk to you about SPARC today. As Julia's already said, and thank you, Julia, I am the Vice President of Membership and Corporate Relations with the Agricultural Retailers Association. And somehow, Julia, my slides aren't moving.
So, Donnie, if you go, I think usually the lower left corner, click on the slide, and then the arrows should be down in the lower left corner there to switch the slides. There you go.
Great. Thank you.
Yep.
As Mark's already alluded to, we know at SPARC that the retailer is basically the agronomic advice driver as far as providing information to the growers, ranchers across America. And this is our mission and our vision as far as what we like to get done from a sustainability aspect. This is the definition we're using for sustainability, just so everyone is clear about which one. There's so many definitions of sustainability out there in the marketplace, but it does include productivity as well as helping agricultural communities prosper. You may be asking yourself why, as an agricultural retailer, should you promote sustainability? As you all know from the consumer aspect, people are making buying decisions quite heavily based on how things are done, raised, as well as how well you take care of your employees. So sustainability is becoming much more important in the consumer decision-making process. As you can see, some of the companies down below that we're working with in preparing this particular training modules. Why should you as a retailer look at sustainability? It is an opportunity to go to your customer base. There are many customers now that have contracted revenue sources as far as their crops are concerned, and they are looking for advisors to help them grow things in a sustainable way. Where do you fit in? As you can see, all the aspects that come to producing a crop on an annual basis, ag retailers are very much involved in every one of those aspects. All of these are available for free. This is a training process that you can put your employees through as well as yourself. And it's an opportunity for you to have discussions not only with your employees but with your customer base about sustainability. These are online learning modules. These are the modules that you can see in front of you. We start off with a basic sustainability 101, and we go all the way down to developing a sustainability program. If you're running an agronomic program at your particular retailer, or if you're the business owner, you may want to start with the last module. That pretty much talks about how to approach it from a business aspect, and then work your way the other way around. As you can see, here are the particular modules and what they look like when you click on the website provided at the bottom. We've also provided a training manual for yourselves as well as your employees. The training manual is a companion to the online modules. It will help you guide your employees through the particular training modules, and also has a variety of opening questions that you can ask them to answer individually, or you can use it as a group discussion to help you understand the material that's provided to you. We also have fact sheets. You can see the categories on the left-hand side. There's also a way that you can customize these fact sheets. On the top right, you can put your logo in place. So this will become like a customized document for your business, and you can use this when going out and talking with your clients and customers. There's also quite a few case studies that we have in there from an economic aspect, so you can understand the powers and the benefits of performing sustainability activities. There's also many other resources that we continue to update and release on an as-needed basis. You'll see slide decks in the future, as well as a series of 5 articles. I think 2 of them are already out in the Crops and Soil magazine. So how do you get started? Basically, here are the ways you can access these resources. It is an excellent opportunity for you to sit down and do employee development by making sure that all your employees are able to go through this particular training module set. And once again, it's free of charge. If you have any questions, feel free to contact any of us. You can see 4 of us here on the slide that are the primary steering committee for SPARC. And I thank you for your time today. Please feel free to reach out, and I'll be glad to help you in the way I can.
Okay, thank you, Donnie, and to Field to Market for being our sponsor today. And now we'll get the presentation started with Justin Mount, Natural Resource Specialist at the USDA Midwest Climate Hub.
Good morning, and thank you for attending today. A little bit of administrative work. Julie, are you going to run the slides? Because I'm still only seeing the first slide of the very start of the presentation.
Yeah, so do you see the first slide of your presentation, you mean?
I don't, but I'm okay. Yeah, I'm okay. So we're on slide 1. And,
yes.
And I'll just say change slide or next for the change. Thank you, and sorry about that, folks.
No, that's okay.
Again, thank you for joining, and to
Justin, do you see, you should have slide control, so you should be able to click on the next slide.
That's what I'm saying. I'm not seeing any of that.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, you can just let me know.
From your side.
Sure. Just let me know
So
when you want to switch slides then.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, for bearing with us, and thanks for our sponsors in the setup. And I want to thank PARM for allowing me to present today. We're going to be using my PDF slides, which will be available. They're not quite as slick and fancy as the PowerPoint, but we're having a little bit of difficulty. But what we want to do is convey some information. We're going to talk a little bit about soil carbon today, but I want to get through this setup and why is soil carbon important. But before we begin that, we're going to start with kind of an agenda. We'll move to the next slide, slide 2. So the things we're going to do today, I want to quickly point out where the USDA climate hubs are and what they do and how you might be able to contact them if you need services or technical assistance from them. We're going to take a look at some observed rainfall data. I like to stay away from kind of the causes and the discussions around climate change, but what we do have is observed data. We can look at those trends, and we can also look at some predictive models on how those trends may be shaping out in the future. Also, what is the functions of a productive soil? We're going to remind ourselves what that is, and we'll talk a little bit about the soil conditioning index and how the integrated erosion tool can generate that value and why the soil conditioning index is a foundational soil health metric. We'll look at some of the integrated erosion tool outputs and how do we get change at a landscape level beyond this postage stamp from a field here and there to more of a watershed and a landscape level. And I also do want to say there's been a lot of excellent soil health work going on within the government and outside of the government. The private sector is driving this strongly as well. And I want to give a high five and synergize with all those people and all the efforts and hours and years of work this went into soil health. And my goal is to build upon that, give us one more tool to help encourage farmers to be a little bit more progressive in prioritizing soil carbon. We'll go to slide 3. USDA climate hubs are regionally located, as you can see on the map here. They're kind of, each region specializes. I'm in the Midwest Climate Hub where we have primary annual row crops. We do know that there are many other land uses, such as orchards and forests, and we can help on all of those land uses. My focus is on annual row crops, but as you can see, California has its own hub, the Northeast and the Northwest have a hub, and you should be able to find information on these hubs online. What do the hubs do? They help provide information that's relevant to your situation or your area, and they can enable decision-making from a climate-informed perspective and how not only this season's trends are going and the weather is unfolding, but how it's likely to happen in the next month or two. Their projections and forecasts are getting more and more reliable all the time. And lastly is the technical support, trying to fill any niche that they know about it is out there and provide that information and a medium for exchanging ideas and challenging one another to continue to help America grow a nutritious and safe food supply. Next slide. If you want to learn more about the Midwest Climate Hub, here's how you can contact them. Dennis Tade is the director. Charlene is the key coordinator there, and we work together. I work with them. I'm on a detail to them for the calendar year 2019, and they would love to hear from people that have relevant needs and things that they could work on. And also they deliver a monthly, sometimes more often, but a monthly climate outlook that anyone is welcome to attend, and reach out to them if you want to learn how to get engaged with that. So we're on slide 5. This is the observed precipitation change in the United States. So this graphic's a little bit busy, but what you need to look at here, some of the colors may come across a little difficult for people. That is, we pick out one of these boxes. If we look at the top, such as the Great Plains North or the Midwest, notice that there's a zero line. Anything above that zero line is an increase over the precipitation over the decades. So this is over the last 100 years. If zero is the average over that 100-year period, anything in that green above is an increase. So what we're seeing is an increase in rainfall for pretty much the entire Midwest, upper Mid-South, the Midwest, and the Northeast, and a little bit in California. Hawaii, which isn't on the map, is showing kind of a near-term decline in precipitation. So what this suggests, and what most of the respected models suggest, is we're going to have more rainfall. Likely a lot of that rainfall is going to happen outside of the growing season, and that's where some of the challenges come in if we want to help farmers conserve their soil and improve their soil health. How can we armor and protect that soil outside of the growing season? Next slide. This slide is the observed change in total annual precipitation falling in the heaviest 1% events. So we have two different models here. On the left is the lower scenario, and on the right is the higher scenario. So if we just focus on the upper left, we see that 42%, we could see an increase of about 42% over the last 100 years of 1% of the rain events being the heaviest. So more rainfall and fewer events. And if we look at the lower left, we see that increase continues, that trend continues. So what that means is we are going to get more rain, but that more total rainfall will fall in fewer events, or there'll be larger events throughout the year. That's kind of the projections, and that's also consistent with what we've seen over the last 115 years. Now we're on to slide 7. This is the precipitation in Iowa from June to August, basically over the last 120 years. And notice there's quite a bit of noise, and when I say noise, that means the band is wider, so we have higher highs and lower lows at the start of the century. Then things kind of calm down a little bit at the start of the 1900s. Then at the start of the 2000, that variability continues to increase. Notice that the highs are pretty high and the lows are low. 2019 is not even on here, so that's going to be another high point. We know the 2012 drought, we can see that staring at us, but look at the variation, the year before and after that 2012 drought. No one can predict what the precipitation in Iowa is going to be in June to August from year to year, but we do anticipate this trend to continue. So we need to be planning for and preparing our farmers, and most importantly, the farm field soil, to be ready for some of these changes. These are pretty big swings, and it can be very challenging to be profitable in these large swings. Next slide, we're on slide 8. Soil water reserves for crops. This is something I want to focus on. Now, if you have irrigation, unlimited irrigation, and energy to pump that irrigation water, this really doesn't apply. I would argue that irrigating an unlimited amount may not be a good stewardship role for the nutrients and the agrochemicals that we apply. But what we can look at here in a dryland setting is organic matter, basically soil carbon. There's many other things in organic matter besides soil carbon. As that organic matter increases, we notice that the amount of water available to plants also increase, and it's a pretty linear relationship. So as we can start to drive up that organic matter, 0.5% to 1%, that can make an enormous difference, especially for the farmers that might be in some of the older soils, the altisols and the alpha sols of the upper Mid-South. There is a competitive advantage for people that are farming in the upper Midwest because they have, many farmers have deep mollisols. Now there's always exceptions on the landscapes and spots within the field. that have lost quite a bit of topsoil in their soil carbon, so they don't get to realize this water exchange rate that they could be realizing. So the main point here is as we increase organic matter, we make more water in the soil available to the plants. And which, as we know, if we look at late July, August, and September data, a lot of times when we're in that grain fill and pod fill period, that water is crucial to realizing maximum yield potential. On slide 9 now, so let's talk a little bit about the crop system considerations resulting from these varied intense events that we're going to see and have seen. So that precipitation variability, there's a couple components there. Spatially, we know that there's going to be more isolation of these heavier storms. Again, no one can predict where that is, and that is consistent with what we've all seen our entire life, that we anticipate that spatial variability to increase. It may intensify from year to year in certain areas, and it may lessen. We just don't know at this time. The timing, we know that there's going to be more rainfall. That trend continues, more total rainfall, and one of the greatest concerns is getting the rainfall outside of the normal crop growing season, outside of those frost-free days. And this is going to result in more weather events leading to excessive soil loss. Sheet and rill erosion could also be wind erosion involved in there, especially when we have these straight line winds sometimes in front of storms. But it also includes ephemeral and gully erosion as well. This is going to increase the likelihood of nutrient loss through the different loss pathways, such as leaching. We know nitrogen and sulfur and some of the key nutrients have the ability to move quite readily. Also runoff. There could be physical runoff if commonly nutrients are surface applied, and if that occurs and a rainfall event is in the near future, we could see the actual physical movement of those agrochemicals and nutrients off-site to receiving waters. And I think Ohio has taken this issue very seriously, and when nutrients are being applied, the applicator has to look at the forecast and make a determination if an intense storm of some levels coming and whether they can make that application or not. So we're starting to see some overhead regulations here on the nutrient application. And as a farming community and agri-retail community, let's stay in front of this so we can minimize the heavy hand of regulation and keep autonomy at the ag-retail level and at the farm field level, and enable people to farm the way they need to farm, but farm in a non-degrading manner while they're doing it. Surface manure applications are still fairly common. It's best to get that manure injected into the ground when possible and pragmatic. But with more rain, we could move off, that manure could move off site to receiving waters and receiving areas, and commonly that could contain pathogens. So there's a public goods, shared public goods issue here, because we all share the air and water, and indirectly the soil and its productivity. So it's going to be helping the nation, the world, but most importantly, your local community. If you can do a really good job to encourage farmers and as applicators to keep those nutrients, agrochemicals on the sites that they're applied to, that's going to be a huge win for not only the image of agriculture, but for the profitability of the farmer. And atmospheric releases. Air quality is a huge indicator of the health of many ecosystems. It's often overlooked, but the main one we'd be concerned about here would be the denitrification and putting the nitrous oxides up to the atmosphere. And agriculture has an opportunity here to help decrease the amount of nitrous oxide and other oxides entering the atmosphere, but specifically from those saturated fields and that nitrogen gassing off. The crop protection chemical side of the equation is going to be interesting as well, because we may have to make adjustments for efficacy. I know this year a lot of pre-programs were pretty successful early on because we had the moisture to activate those pre-emergent herbicides. But we also realize with extremely heavy rainfall events that the crop protection chemicals may not be in the zone that they need to be in, especially with pre-emergent herbicides, wanting them in that top layer of soil to intercept any new weed growth or weed germination, and may have to make adjustments on what suite of chemistries that we use and when they're applied for that crop that's being grown. And moving agrochemicals, I heard that, I think one of the opening speakers mentioned that. It's important that we realize that the crop protection chemicals and the nutrients that are applied to the field can move. So let's do our best job to get them on that site and retain them on that site. And there's multiple ways to do that. We have excellent spray technology and adjuvants, and we have the ability to put a lot of the nutrients and other things into the ground with minimal soil disturbance. We don't have to do that full width tillage like we might have seen 30, 40 years ago. Off-site impacts. Once these chemicals move off-site, they can be very toxic to fish and other aquatic animals, but they can also pollute waters, the receiving waters that may lead and feed reservoirs for the local community. So again, it's a national effort to improve this. Retailers in our community, if we can utilize that soil to decontaminate and clean the water that's leaving the field, we're going to be ultimately providing ourselves and our community with cleaner drinking water. It's pretty much that. So I got in here the increased need for drainage. This is kind of a hot topic. I've been challenged on this, but one of the primary ways to increase crop yields is to ensure you have adequate drainage of water, removing excess water or perhaps lowering a water table, all within the local regulations and laws. But as rainfall events increase, there may be a need for increased surface and subsurface drainage. Here, farmers have another opportunity to treat that effluent that's coming out of the tile lines. We can do that with edge of field wetlands, these bioreactors, and there's many other technologies that are emerging and becoming more and more available. I think it's imperative that we have low maintenance technologies at the edge of field treatment. But if we're just running a lot of field water out through a tile, there is a potential that there could be contaminants in that field water. And if that tile is going right into surface water, that could affect the quality of that surface water, then ultimately the groundwater that is fed by that surface water. Field days reduced now. As a fifth generation farmer, this gets me pretty excited. I grew up farming in southernmost Illinois, and any time that we were delayed to get in the field, it was kind of an issue because timeliness is huge to maximize yield potential, all the way from planting to applying crop protection chemicals, to doing a timely harvest and getting that cover crop established. And if we're going to reduce the days that we have to do pre-plant preparations, as we saw this year, it was a massive crunch and still is for the ag retailers in the service time to do the high-level job that they've done for decades at the field level. There was a big push to get work done quick. Some things got skipped. Some applications didn't happen in a timely manner. Everybody's working hard to get it done, but if we can't get in the field without rutting it up or getting stuck, we're unable to get those applications made. In planting the crop, I was home this year farming with my dad a little bit, and it was far from ideal. We're having a little bit of trouble getting the drill to be consistent across the width of the drill due to tracks, and we were seeing a little bit of sidewall smear, probably going a little bit early, but I think that's kind of a row crop area that some crops not being mudded in. I'm not saying we mudded in crops or farmers did, but not planting into ideal conditions. Yes, it's important to plant into soil, but we want to minimize that sidewall shear and some other things that can happen when that soil is not friable like we'd like to see it in ideal planting conditions. Again, the timeliness of nutrient crop protection chemicals is huge. If we can't get in there for a week to 10 days, that could make a massive impact on the efficacy of herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides. It's not that we can control the weather and do all these things, but as we are looking at the cropping system, we need to be talking to the farmer about what's our plan A, then plan B, and I think this year we got down into that plan C and D range or a little farther beyond. Harvest, we saw the 28 harvest be pretty muddy. And the fact is the combines are going to roll, they're going to move no matter what the conditions are unless they're getting stuck out in the field. So harvest will occur, but there could be some aftermath. We may have to deal with some ruts, some compaction, which can last for years and rob crop yield. And if we have a wet harvest, it's not very realistic to expect people to be chasing the combine with a drill and trying to get those cover crops established. We're going to the next slide, slide 10. This slide pretty much shows that we burned about all the soil carbon out of the soil that we can. So a lot of the carbon has been removed. When we started farming heavily in the early 1900s, massive amounts of high levels of inversion tilling and plowing were common. We didn't have the tools that we have today. We didn't have all the crop protection chemicals and the machinery and the delivery mechanisms and the nutrient formulations that we have. You can see that that has turned, that trend has turned, and it continues to increase. But there's still quite a bit of work to be done to put carbon back in the soil. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's important and how we can do that. Slide 11. This is a soil productivity index across the whole nation. It's kind of a crude map, and you can see those higher productive areas in the where we think of the Midwest, upper Midwest, annual row crop areas, and then other areas of the U.S. are also productive. But what I want to point out here is the functions of the soil. Let's remind ourselves the USDA NRCS approach to functions of the soil. And the first one is to partition and regulate the flow of water. What happens to that raindrop or that snow melt water droplet when it comes in contact with the soil surface or the residue on the soil surface? How is it partitioned, and where does the fate of that water molecule end up? Is it going across the top of the soil surface, or is it being infiltrating deeply or in a shallow manner? So the soil is pretty huge on buffering what happens with the water. Cycling of nutrients. Soil is a media of exchange for all the primary, secondary, and micronutrients that the plant needs, and that's why we apply the nutrients. Nitrogen is critical. If we're going to realize maximum yield potential, we will have to apply nutrients in a judicious manner. Third there is to buffer and filter contaminants. This is often overlooked. The fact is agrochemicals do have the potential to pollute when they move off-site or they're applied incorrectly, but the soil has a great affinity to buffer and filter those contaminants and minimize the amount of pollution that might leave the site, but also literally degrade a lot of the chemicals. Many of the crop protection chemicals and seed treatments we use have short half-lives, and a healthy soil is able to decompose those molecules and break them down into simpler and simpler molecules to where they're not a concern of being a contaminant off-site or even within the soil. And provide structural support. This not only goes for being a media for plant growth, but it also can hold up the rogator, the applicator, the floater truck that comes across, the planter and the tractor. So that structural support is important, and as soil carbon increases, commonly that structural support increases, and the days that a farmer can get into the field may also be increased. But don't overlook the structure of the soil and how much or how little it gets compacted with each field operation. What's going on out there? I'd encourage you to get a shovel and take a look, at the tire track versus the non-tire track, and what can we do to increase the structural support of the soil. And lastly is the productivity and biodiversity. Many things live on, migrate across, and live within the soil. That includes many, many microbes. The soil has a microbiome just like us as humans all do. It's composed of billions and trillions of microbes and bacteria and viruses and all kinds of other things that we think we know about and many that we don't. But that also includes, field mice and things that may live in the soil, gophers and groundhogs. Not that you want a lot of groundhogs out in your crop field, but then also the deer and turkey traveling across the top of the field and migratory wildlife that may be utilizing that field for a certain period of time. And next slide, we're on slide 12. This is the benefits of soil carbon. You notice that we have two axes here. We have time at the bottom. As the time increases on the x-axis, soil qualities on the y-axis, and as it goes up, it increases. But on the very front of this, on the very leftmost, that white line is the soil carbon. So soil carbon has to start to increase, and that takes time before there's a little bit of a lag for these other attributes and the benefits of soil carbon to be realized. So it's important that we're transparent as we're working with farmers, and as ag retailers can step in and find a profit model in here to increasing soil carbon, that we're in the long game. We're not in the season to season game. We're looking at the 2, 3, 5 year longer game to get these benefits of the soil carbon. But once they kick in, they're robust benefits and they're sustained benefits. The first one is that first leading dashed line is aggregation and infiltration. So if I have less soil crusting and better infiltration, better wetting and re-wetting of the soil, I'm going to be a more productive farmer. I'm going to have better crop emergence. I'm going to have better crop available water. And when I talk about re-wetting, that's a really important one, because a lot of times soils will get nearly depleted of soil moisture. And when that next rain event comes, which could be a very strong event, commonly in summer we have thunderstorm fronts, how much re-wetting ability does that soil have? If I get a 1-inch rain over 40 minutes, which isn't the hardest rain we'd have by any means, but that's still a pretty strong rain, can I take in 90% or 100% of that rain and bring that water into the soil profile for crop use? So that re-wetting ability and infiltration are enormous, and that's one of the first benefits that the farmer's going to see, and primarily that's due to increased organic matter and a lot typically more residue, and that soil surface is armored. As a general rule, I've heard it said you don't want to find the soil unless you go looking for it. If you step out into a field or you're up in a big crop applicator and you're seeing bare soil everywhere, that could be that farmer might be compromising some of the functions of their soil. It doesn't mean the farmer's wrong or they're doing a bad job. It means the farmer has an opportunity. The next line would be the water and nutrient holding capacity. Again, that infiltration is going to drive the amount of water coming into the profile. But if I can store more water, like inches, if I can, instead of storing 4 inches of water in the soil, I can store 6. I have a bigger increase. I have more resiliency for my crop as far as being in drought status. So that's one thing to look at, right? If some crops will show in poor functioning soils, the crop will show water stress even though we're not in a meteorological drought. So before drought's kicked on at the county level, those crops could be showing stress, and that shouldn't be happening in a properly functioned soil. Now, if we're in a true drought and it hasn't rained for weeks and the corn's tasseling, yeah, it's going to use a lot of water and it's going to start to show that water stress quickly. But you'll notice the fields that have better soil function, higher soil carbon, the onset of that showing the drought and the yield drag from a drought will be delayed a little bit. Nutrient holding capacity, the more cation exchange capacity I have and the higher soil carbon I have, I'm going to be able to cycle and exchange those nutrients, and over time the soil can start to provide a minor amount of nutrients. So it may lead to a minor reduction in some of the nutrient inputs that we have. Again, we're still going to have to use the NP and K inputs to get the high yields that we're shooting for, and we need to be profitable. But the soil has the ability to provide some nutrients back. Also, productivity starts to increase as these other soil function attributes do increase well. But notice productivity is it lags a little bit as well. So that's important to portray that message as farmers embark on increasing soil carbon. That some of these things, such as yield, which is a keystone factor that a lot of people look at, may not be there that first year. They may happen, but likely they will not. They should start showing up in years 3, 4, 5 or beyond. But every field and every situation is a little different. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, is the air and water quality improvements that we see and the wildlife habitat benefits that arise out of increasing soil carbon. Okay, we'll move to the next slide, slide 13. Okay, this slide is a little bit busy, but let's break it down. And this slide is by Dr. Caitlin Peterson, and I got to meet with Caitlin for a few hours because I wanted to fully understand what's going on here. To me, this slide's very powerful because it brings in the resiliency concept associated with a ball and basin theory. So this is a concept that's been used for a few decades in ecosystem sciences. If we look at the top middle of the graphic, we have a healthy soil, and we notice that there is kind of a deep valley, and that ball is setting in a productive basin. If you notice a ball there, and it can go up and down in that productive basin. It has a little bit of latitude, right? It maybe can take some excess moisture, maybe it can handle excess heat. The crop can handle the excess heat because there's more moisture in the soil, or the soil is less prone to drought conditions because it has a higher functionality. Now, if we have a severe event, that ball could go over into the unproductive basin, and the higher those ridges are, the more disturbance it takes to make a change. So one way that you, sitting around the coffee shop or the retail counter, you could talk about this is you could put a ball bearing or some sort of ball in a relatively flat plate, and it'll move around. But as soon as you tip that plate much, that ball falls off and it goes into another regime, right? And it's going to take energy to get that ball back up on the plate. Then you could take a bowl that had fairly high sides, or it could be a little bit rounded, but it had a higher side than your plate, and put that ball bearing in there or ball and move it around. It's going to take a bigger tip to get that ball out of that bowl. So what I'm suggesting is the less healthy soil would be a flat metal. We notice that it doesn't take a lot to get out of that productive regime and get into the unproductive regime, whereas the top one, a healthier system, is more quote-unquote resilient to that change. See how you can help your team encourage farmers to think this way in their system. Now, one thing I did learn from Dr. Peterson is all systems are resilient. And that really made me pause. I'm thinking, well, I thought a system had to be good and productive and non-degrading. But no, to her point, every system is resilient, just like our own personal matters, right? We have a resiliency in our finances to some level or the other. The same way with the farmer. If you have a farmer that's very traditional and is heavy-duty conventional, they may be minimizing some of the soil health benefits that they could see by, having a less healthy system. It's not that conventional farming is bad. That's not what I'm suggesting, but it's resilient to other things, right? It's resilient to taking on that next big rainfall event. Most of it's going to run off. So it is resilient in a way, but I would argue that it's not in a productive way, and it could be in a degrading way. And ultimately, it could rob the farmer of some of their profitability, and it actually will. So it's one way to look at it. But again, all systems and soils are resilient. If we have those soils that have been conventionally farmed for decades, it may take quite a few years of high residue farming, cover crops, and a whole other suite of practices to get that system more healthy and more resilient to change. But as we get a healthier system, we notice that the benefits of the internal regulations start to improve. We have better soil conservation, which is keystone in my mind, where we can start to pick up more weed and seed suppression, maybe disrupt some of those pest and pathogen cycles. We can help recruit beneficial insects, which may lead to a reduction in the need for some crop protection chemicals. And we do have better nutrient cycling, both nitrogen and carbon. That carbon cycling is very important, especially as we start to prioritize soil carbon in that system. Then an externally regulated approach. Again, I'm not suggesting one's better than the other. The farmer gets to decide how they want to farm and which approach they want. But the externally regulated approach requires more input and more management, and is more fragile and is more susceptible to minor changes. Let's go on to the next slide. So how do we, well, on slide 14, looking at soil conditioning index, how do we improve soil carbon? And I've heard a lot about it, and I don't really have time to run all the tests and dig every root up and look at it. And so what can we do? Well, we can run models. And NRCS USDA has some excellent models, and one of the things I want to focus on is this simple metric of soil conditioning index. Now, the SCI is not the bee's knees of everything, but what it is in many locations, not all locations, is a general indicator for your trend. A lot of things in farming are about trends. Agronomy and farming are exceedingly complex. Everybody on the phone knows that. Things are changing a lot. We have a lot of good tools, but there's a lot of options out there in the way we get things done and how we get them done. So I'm offering that the soil conditioning index lets us identify trend. And the SCI is composed of three things, basically the organic matter, how much of that organic matter is returned to the soil or removed, field operations, every time I'm going across that field with any operation, what impact is it having on the soil? Am I introducing more oxygen down in the soil profile, or am I just driving across doing a crop protection application? And the third is erosivity and how much erosion is occurring, sheet, rill, and wind erosion. And those all work together, those three variables work together to make the soil conditioning index. So onto the next slide, slide 15, SCI here. If we look at the field operations, here's some examples. We have planting operations, row cultivation, all types of tillage and land leveling. So we can get pretty aggressive with our field operations. As we move around to the ER, which is erosion, we have sheet and rill erosion, and we have the wind-induced erosion comprised of siltation, creep, and suspension. Now, it's important to know that USDA currently does not account for ephemeral and gully erosion, and many of us know that that's a concern on many fields. Those things start, that's ephemeral and gully are water-induced erosion events, and they start from sheet and rill erosion. But currently, USDA is not holding farmers accountable for those types of soil loss on their field. But as ag retailers and as people that care about how farming is perceived and how profitable our farmers are and can be, these things are huge. Just disking in the gullies and the ephemerals from year to year indicates a broader problem or perhaps a broader opportunity to minimize that. In the organic matter additions, we have plant roots, manure and mulch, anything that we're adding back into that on top of the soil or into that soil profile, but we also have removals. Silage is a big time removal, but that also includes grain, burning, baling, and grazing. So what ways am I moving plant matter from that field? Moving on to the next slide. So as a farm kid, I think, well, what's ideal here? That's all fine and good, Justin, with the SCI, but what am I shooting for? How can I talk to the farmer? How can I coach change and encourage change and include my ag retail operation in that? Well, with the field operations, if we can really take that disturbance down to just the nutrient placement and the planting event, and then do an emergency tillage when we only need to. If we have to do deep ripping to address fall ruts that we got in 2018, we may have to do that. This spring didn't really allow for any deep tillage, but there was a lot of leveling tillage, and I would consider that emergency tillage because you saw a lot of long-time no-tillers and people that had to get their field level to get a good seed bed. Getting that seed off to a great start is key to realizing top yields. With erosion, shoot for total combined erosion of less than a ton, and make sure that there's no visible, gullies and ephemerals out there. And if they are, maybe those areas could be treated differently, or maybe even pulled out of production and seeded down and managed a different way. A lot of times we realize that 80% of the erosion is occurring on 20% of the field. Now the models, if you're like, well, how do I know if it's less than a ton? You can work with your local NRCS office. You can also use an excellent tool called the Field Print Calculator that Field to Market offers, and it'll give you an idea of what your erosion rates are for that modeled cropping system for a given location. Again, these are trends. Don't get hung up if the number's 1.1 and I'm not below 1. If you're near 1, near or below 1, you're doing a really good job on your total erosion and couple that with kind of a field inspection, making sure there's no big ephemerals or gullies out there. Then in the organic matter side of it, the goal is to have a continuous living root in the soil. If we can look at that crop rotation and balance the high carbon and low carbon crops and maybe put in some other crops into that system besides just corn and soybeans, there's going to be an improved opportunity to have more living root. This is where cover crops obviously come in. The quicker we can get cover crops established on many millions of more acres, the more carbon that we can start to drive in the soil, and we can start to remove a little bit of that carbon from the atmosphere. Going to the next slide, slide 17. A little bit of background on the Integrated Erosion Tool. The version that I'm talking about runs the Water Erosion Prediction Project model for water-induced erosion, and it runs the Wind Erosion Prediction System for wind-induced erosion. So it does both of wind and water-induced erosion for the field whenever you enter the cropping system. And this is all used on a shared and common database, and we call that LMOD, the Land Management Operation Database, and it has operations and vegetative growth objects in there. So like a corn, when I plant corn, it can grow that corn, and it has all the operations, tillage, and planting, and nutrient and crop protection applications that may be also part of that cropping system. Going to the next slide, slide 18, IET will model both wind and water-induced erosion. And this just gives you a snapshot of where the lower right graphic shows the potential sheet and rill erosion index, and you can see where those are the highest in the higher rainfall areas, and then also the total wind erosion, where it's the green would mean not much wind erosion, and as we get towards the red and the pink, I'd have higher wind erosion. So many states in the central part of the U.S. get to entertain and enjoy both water and wind-induced erosion. But the fact is, you really don't know the level of wind and water-induced erosion unless you run the models and run them correctly. And again, your technical service provider, many CCAs on this call, and many other people know how to run these tools and get these trend estimates. Next slide, slide 19. This is a brief overview of the Integrated Erosion Tool interface, and it is currently, the version I have is anchored to ArcMap. The field print calculator is not anchored to ArcMap, but one of the advantages of using it with an ArcMap is I have a digital map, so a reference. So if you look here on the left, you can see there's a field there, but there's also a road and a receiving water and communities nearby. So a good planner, a good ag retail service provider is going to be aware of these things. You're still going to be able to farm the way you need to farm, but just be cognizant of what's around me, what's potential impacts that I could have. And that's always the case, whether we're near a community or receiving water, but the stakes could be a little bit higher if we have that much public visibility on what we're doing and the impacts of what we did later. If that 3-inch rain comes through, what is it going to do to that receiving reservoir? You notice here in the workflow, I've got it tabbed out 1 through 8. It's pretty straightforward. There's these basic panels in the Integrated Erosion Tool, which this is available to anyone in the public. You do need ArcMap 10.3 or ArcMap 10.5. We're working hard to get a public web-based website for this, and just haven't got it done yet. I'm looking for more sponsors to get it done. I think there would be great utility in using it. But again, there's partners out there that have similar platforms. They are a little bit different. Here, we're just looking at the cropping system. And as we work down through this workflow, we start with the soil and climate. I've selected a field. This field's in Iowa. So it starts to give me information about the field and which soils I can model in there. And as I go on down, I can set my slope length at number 2, set a field shape, which can be important for that orientation, and shape can be important for wind erosion. Then when I get down to number 4, that's where it gets pretty exciting. We'll look at more in depth at that. We can define the timing and sequence of the field operations. That's the actual cropping system. When I'm talking to a farmer, if I've listened to them and understand their cropping system, what they're planning to do, now plans change, but what they're planning to do, I can see as an ag retail service provider or as a frontline agronomist, I can see where there's opportunity to get crop protection applied. I can see where there's opportunity to get cover crops established or terminated. It just gives you a much better understanding of what the farmer's equipment complement is and what their timing of operations are going to be. Then IET has several outputs with it. So the Integrated Erosion Tool is a great way to have that crop system conversation with farmers and teach them about the soil conditioning index and looking at those trends, their erosion trend and the carbon trend. Begin to coach them and encourage them to address those matters. This is the crops and operations panel. Kind of at a glance here, we have a date, we have an operation. I'm on slide 20. Operation and a crop and a residue, then we have our yields. So we can model over 100 different crops. Clearly all the major commodity crops are included, but it's much more broad than that. So I'm not just talking to corn and soybean farmers. We can do orchards, specialty crops, organic operations, all types of things. And a lot of times we may use a surrogate vegetation. If we don't have that exact vegetation in here, we can use something that's pretty close, again, to give us a trend. We're not looking at precise numbers, but we want to understand a trend. And on the lower right here, we have the soil tillage intensity rating information. That lets me see at a glance how actively is the farmer working that soil or disturbing that soil. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're moldboard plowing and doing full inversion, but we can see, these stirs are really, really good. Only one goes up to 12, so the no-till standard in NRCS varies, but it's anywhere between being below 10 and 20 stir. Getting below 10 stir is very low disturbance system. That's a pure no-till system with not many attachments on the planter. The higher the stir goes is indicative of more soil disturbance and tillage. And some of that tillage may have to take place if we have to do emergency tillage to address certain agronomic and soil issues. This system here, I think it's a 4-crop system, and there's cover crops, chasing that combine in the fall and trying to get those cover crops established. I kind of jokingly say, cover crops need to be treated as a crop. It's an O, not an A. It's not cover crop, it's cover crop. And it's important that it's treated as a crop, and the investments and the agronomy go into that crop to make it well established and meaningful. And as service providers looking at this cropping system, even if you write it out by hand, you can start to talk to the farmer, and if you know their equipment complement, can they handle heavy duty 250 bushel BT corn in the fall with their drill, or is it just going to rip the drill apart and you've just destroyed a relationship? Yes, things can be applied from the air or from high ground rigs, but sometimes the seed establishment and the crop growth may not be as good. But there's many ways to get it done. I have seen aerial applications be exceedingly successful if the rains come and just everything aligns right. And so I just lean on this community to figure out that best solution. Going to the next slide, slide 21. I wish my PowerPoint was working because the transitions would be good here. So when you look at this, you're like, well, man, there's a lot of information here. So let's start in the middle right. And these are the Integrated Erosion Tool outputs that we can easily view. And on the right, we see the soil conditioning index is 1.1, and what are the factors driving that? We have really good organic matter input, and we have a low erosion rate here. And you can start to talk to the farmer about that. If they have high erosion, but they're doing really good with everything else, maybe they have to do some infield practices to cut that slope length and reduce or put in barriers if it's wind to reduce that erosion. As we look at the bottom middle, we get that the stir rating for each year, and we can also see if there's any particulate matter being blown off by wind. In this example, there wasn't, but we can easily generate examples where that can be several tons per acre per year, which could be important if you're near sensitive areas such as a respiratory care center, any type of school, or just any public use area. Nobody likes to be dusted out by a windstorm. And then and also with the wind events, 2 to 4 times more organic matter leaves the soil surface in a wind event versus a common water-induced erosion event. So that's kind of fascinating in itself, and a lot of that's due to the electricity that's generated and the particles that the wind can grab off the soil surface through that saltation, creep, and suspension process. Then the average fuel use. This is a good metric if you're trying to coach farmers to make a change. Fuel use may go up or down, but it's kind of a metric you can look at, especially if they're heavy tillage. A lot of times you can bring that fuel use number down while you're accounting for additional crop protection applications that may have to occur if we do reduce tillage. Now, if we look on the left here, this is the wind erosion graph, and it says, well, we have about an average annual erosion of around 12, 13, about 13 to 15 tons if you look at that dot in the upper left of that graph. But we have a range of 0 to 30 tons. So is the farmer comfortable with that? Here we have pretty high wind erosion. There obviously need to do some work. The little blue dots across the top are extreme outliers, but they can occur. What these models do is they use they take 50 years of climate data, then generate a 100-year event. Generate events over 100 years. So there's going to be extremes in there. And in any given year, no one knows what that next year extreme event may or may not be. Lastly is the top. And growing up in southernmost Illinois, water-induced erosion was our biggest concern. We would be on the lookout for wind erosion and making sure we have that soil surface covered, and we're not, taking moisture and other things off that soil surface from those heavy winds that we can't experience. But if at this location, if you look at that top line, that's precipitation. We see that the mean rainfall is 41 inches, but in a dry year it could be 27, and in a wet year, similar to 2019, it might go up to 63 inches. So this farmer is farming, and the potential of that variability exists from year to year. No one knows what it's going to be, if it'll be that extreme or not. But the farmer needs to be aware of that, and most of them are, right? But what they may not be aware of is, here we have a mean soil loss, if we look at that next line down, of several tons per acre. But in a dry year, we can see, well, there's basically no water-induced erosion. That kind of makes sense. It was dry. But in a wet year, instead of having that 9.5 ton average, which is too high, they would have to be, that's well over T, soil loss value of T, which, as a side note, I think is a political value. It's hard for any soil to lose 3, 4, 5 tons a year and replace that soil. So the farmer really loses with that value. So they should be shooting for, getting down to that 1 ton per acre. But this farmer in this cropping system at this location has erosion of basically 0 all the way up to 42 ton per acre per year in that extreme wet year. That could be the worst case scenario. Is that likely to happen? Maybe not. Could it happen? Maybe. The farmer just needs to decide. Again, it's not a way to police or beat up the farmer. Just let them know the amount of risk they have with their cropping system. Then if you want to really get into some of the deeper agronomy of cover cropping and some other increasing the soil carbon, we can start to look at runoff, plant transpiration, and soil evaporation. Notice how that runoff level in a dry year is pretty minimal. It can go up to 20 inches of leaving the field in that max year. And what is that average? It's about 7.5 inches, but I know that we could remodel this and put more residue, less tillage, bring that erosion down, and that runoff number is going to go down. So that moisture is now going into the soil, and some part of it will be available to the plant, depending on the soil health structure and the site and the plant roots and a bunch of other factors that you could start to demonstrate to the farmer. Would a couple more inches of soil in that August time of water and in August be helpful? Well, theoretically, by changing their cropping system, they could realize that. And also, the soil evaporation is a very powerful indicator, especially for people who are heavy-duty conventional farming, doing lots of tillage. You can just show them by increasing soil, the surface residue, how that evaporation number can decline greatly. Moving on to the next slide. I'm on slide 22. This is the Integrated Erosion Tool, some of the graphs available for analysis here. The upper left is net surface cover. This is sometimes, they call NRCS the dirt police once in a while, but we are bound by law to come out and look at residue levels. And the keystone residue level, in my opinion, in many annual row crop systems is, what does the field look like 7 to 10 days after planting? that's typically when the residue goes down. And you can see here that we're getting below that 30, well below that 30% net residue cover in this example in the upper left as that dips way down. But after that one crop is established, net surface cover goes up. So there may be an opportunity before the establishment of that one crop that pulls the surface residue down so low to keep that residue up. Being in compliance, it's not about just meeting the regulations and the laws, but it's also more about increasing the farmer profitability by keeping that soil surface covered, and that's been known for decades to be very beneficial. The graph on the lower right is the live root mass, and I like this one. We do have another graph that's still, it's kind of silly. It's dead root mass, so they're inverted from one another. But this live root mass starts to get pretty exciting because I can look there and see, well, man, there's a pretty long periods, months and months of no living root in the soil profile. Well, if we don't have a living root in the soil profile, we don't have the root exudates, we don't have fuel for the soil mycorrhiza, getting those fungal hyphae established. We don't have the nutrient cycling's decline. The living root does so much within the soil that we're just starting to understand. It cannot be underestimated. And this is a way to approach a farmer and their cropping system, understanding their cropping system. Maybe 1 or 2 falls, I can get a cover crop established and have that living root mass in there. No one can predict how long the fall and warm it'll be or how cold the winter will be, but the best thing you can do is you make a plan, you follow that cropping system, and you plan to have living root in that crop field as long as you can. Then you leave it up to the local ag experts, the ag retailers on the phone, the CCAs and the farmer. Do they want to plant green? Do they want to terminate? What else is going to happen? There's a profit space in here, in my mind, for ag retailers in planting the cover crop seed, selling the cover crop seed, getting it established. I've seen for years nutrient anhydrous being applied by our local service provider. Why couldn't they be running a drill? Yes, there's a cost for that. But after we get established, we have to manage that crop. We may need to add a little bit of nutrients to the cover crop to get the good growth we're looking for. Then we need to terminate it, and there can be some pest challenges. So it's a whole other system in a profit space that I believe the ag retailers can be profitable in. And I really believe this, not just because I'm talking to this group, is if we don't get the ag retailers and the frontline agronomists involved in pushing more and more cover crops and looking at what Army Corps and EPA are calling nature-based solutions, we're just going to see 2 to 3 to 4% of annual row crops and cover crops each year, which is woefully inadequate. And it's a missed opportunity for our soils to pull a little bit of carbon out of the atmosphere. But most importantly, it's a missed opportunity for the farmer to increase mid and long-term profitability. Next slide. So the primary takeaways here, if we look at that graphic on the left real quick, basically the more carbon that I bring onto a farm in the form of plants and animals, the more profitable and diverse that farm's going to be. And that's been proven time and time again. So what are ways to do that? Not everybody wants to reintroduce livestock back on their operation. I know when I left the farm to work for NRCS, Dad sold the cattle 2 weeks later because it's a lot of work. But it did give us diversity in our income. It did give us a way to cycle nutrients naturally within those fields that needed to be grassed down and not cropped. So more plants, more animals on the farm is a win for the farmer and should be a win for the local input supplier. So the primary takeaways for the Integrated Erosion Tool and the Soil Conditioning Index is we can digitally document that row crop system. And again, tip of the hat to Field to Market, because they have the field parent calculator and some of their partners too as well. Find a tool that works for you that will allow you to digitally document that row crop system. And you can start to get values out of that, such as the Soil Conditioning Index and your stir value. The lower we have the stir, the more farm profit potential we have, because we're going to have more soil carbon. Lower total erosion is better field conditions more often and a higher SCI, and the more organic matter additions result in an improving soil conditioning index trend. And again, that year-round living root is the goal. We can't do that all the time, but if we looked at like a 4 to 5 year cropping system, perhaps most falls, maybe not every fall, we can have a cover crop in there, or we can introduce a winter cash crop such as canola, wheat, durum, or something. And most people have semis. A lot of people get worried about markets, but you can typically truck stuff. You may not make a lot of money on the, but the amount of carbon you're pumping into the soil and the diversity you're bringing to your crop rotation is going to have sustained agronomic benefits for years to come. IET results are field specific for the system that's modeled, and it's, integrated erosion tool sits on top of 2 process-based models. Basically what that means is there's a lot of numbers moving around, a lot of computations, and there's multiple variables due to the climate and the type of soils and the slope and the location and the weather and the heat that can grow the crop. And the integrated erosion tool can count for irrigation too. So if you're in a dry area and you are growing 260 bushel corn, the model will do that as long as we have irrigation. If you're in that dry area trying to grow high yields, the model will not grow it out because you don't have enough water. So we can address the irrigation inputs. And as a reminder, we don't account for ephemeral and gully erosion. So get out there and take a look at the fields. I know if I've got some applicators on the phone, you probably know right where all those ditches are if you found them the hard way. I mean, we've all accidentally hit something that we didn't know was there. Bring that to your farmer's attention in a respectful way, and just let them know it's not only hard on your equipment, they're losing soil, and that they might want to be able to address that runoff that's leading to that concentrated flow erosion. And I know those can be challenging conversations, but many of you all have the tact and the approach that works well there. Going on to the next slide, and we're starting to get near the end here. How can we do this? So my thesis is economic incentives and financial resiliency benefits will encourage annual row crop farmers to prioritize and manage for increasing soil carbon. Well, that sounds good, Justin, but how are we going to do it? Well, short term, the government can help us. We have these excellent 2018 Farm Bill programs that will strongly incentivize cover crops and other in-field practices, high residue farming, and crop rotation practices. Long term, we're going to see a reduced crop yield variability with an increased yield trend. So that yield should slightly start to tick up consistently. We're going to have more plant water. We talked about that re-wetting ability. Once that soil is dry and here comes that next thunderstorm, how much of that rainfall event can I pull into that soil profile? The runoff events are going to be cleaner. We're going to have improved cycling of all nutrient classes. And there's going to be more days that we can get into the field. And that's been huge here in 2019. A day or two was enormous. Whichever farmers had that structure and they could get in their field and spend more hours in there, they're going to have a competitive advantage, and they'll probably have higher yields. And also, as input suppliers, you want to be able to get in the field and not do damage to it, noticeable rutting or anything. And I understand sometimes, you got to go when you got to go, or the farmer tells you to go, and you let them know we're rutting, but they still move anyway. But with more soil carbon, better soil structure, we can minimize those occurrences. That financial resiliency is going to increase because the profit's more stable, especially if we introduce livestock on the farm. I'm not suggesting all row crop farmers are going to do that, but that is an opportunity. And again, I want to echo that the ag retailers have to be integrated into this business model if we're going to see these soil carbon increases, not only at the farm field level, but also at the entire watershed or your entire service area. Can we make an impact on tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of acres? We have around 400 million acres of cropland in the United States, of annual cropland. So there's great opportunity there. Carbon markets, there's some out there, they're kind of fledgling, but we do have new ones emerging. And we know the airline industry is wanting to offset their carbon emissions, and more people continue to fly. So there's going to be an opportunity there for farmers too. Here at the bottom are some examples of some of the NRCS conservation practices that can help us increase soil carbon. Many of you are familiar with these. Many of you use these practices, and thank you. Keep talking to your local NRCS office, your conservation district. Sometimes extension and state people offer ideas. A lot of times you can apply to do on-farm research. If you have a progressive farmer that says, well, let's just take this 40 and split it several different ways and do some research, there's grants out there to help you do that. Cover crop, again, is a keystone one, but there's other approaches that we can use to help retain and increase soil carbon. Going to slide 25, that's going to wrap me up, Julia, and I want to thank everybody for making time to join today, and hopefully I have time for a couple questions, and I'll turn it back over to you, Julia.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing, Justin. We do have time for Q&A, so attendees, please enter your questions into the question box on your screen. And the first question we're going to get started with is, how much water can organic fraction absorb during weather events compared to mineral soil?
That's a great question. I don't know the exact number, but mineral, if we just look at sand, silt, and clay, clay can hold a little bit of water. Sand and silt won't hold much water, so it's going to be orders of magnitude higher for organic matter. So much more. I don't really honestly know how to say a numeric value, but the more soil organic matter I have, the more water I can absorb and retain in my soil profile.
Okay, next question is, what is the role of mulch compared to actual organic content of the soil? I am particularly interested in runoff potential.
So a couple ways to look at it. Good question. Mulch is, we're looking at protecting the soil surface and increasing microbial activity at the soil surface on top of the soil, where organic matter is more within the soil. So there's kind of two different components, but that is a great system. If you do have access to a desirable mulch product, or you're mulching crops on site, you're covering the soil surface, you're cooling it, you're reducing evaporation and the parallel flow of wind across the soil, and you're just protecting the soil in many, many ways. Whereas soil organic matter is more, it'll be transitioned from the soil horizon down into the profile through the night crawlers, the worms, the pill bugs, all kinds of other macroinvertebrates and vertebrates that will pull those plant residues down into the profile.
Okay, next question is, can CO2 levels in the atmosphere be reduced by making significant increases in soil carbon?
Okay, this is a great question. So the soil outside of the ocean, the soil holds the most carbon with flora and fauna when we look at the whole nation, the whole globe. So the fact of the matter is, soil will pull in pretty minimal amounts of carbon each year, 1 to 2 tons in some of the most progressive systems, but a half ton can be realized in most any system that's adopting a high residue. So not a lot, but here's the kick. We can make changes today, each year, from year to year on annual row crop acres. So we have a little over 400 million acres in the U.S. Theoretically, we could make a change on tens and tens of millions of acres each year to increase cover crops, for example, or to increase that soil, to increase soil carbon. That is different than planting a forest. A tree is about 45 to 50% carbon. The keystone way to remove carbon is planting a forest. Not many row crop farmers want to plant a forest. Not many ag retailers on this phone want forests planted on the fields that they service. A forest is a major land use change. It takes decades. So it's a combination of all of these land uses across the globe, but the U.S. farmer is so agile and so good at what they do, we can make those changes, within a couple years, 1 year realistically. So we can have a minor impact each year. Then over decades, we can have a massive impact by using the soil to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. Excellent question.
All right, next question is, what's the best way to measure carbon quantity? The C to N ratio, or what's a high number, what's a low number, and a good number in a corn-soybean rotation? There's a lot of questions there. Sorry, Justin.
That's all right. Yeah, looking at your crop rotation, high carbon crops to low carbon crops. So if I've got corn and wheat, those are high carbon. If I'm growing canola and soybeans, those are low carbon. So I'm kind of picking on the major commodity crops. Sitting down with the farmer, if the farmer is just doing corn and soybeans, they have one high carbon, one low carbon crop at the same time. So it's important to understand that in the cropping system, how much is that's there. And you can say, well, am I going to be increasing carbon or decreasing? Now there's pros and cons, right? As soon as I drive up my carbon, I might be immobilizing nutrients because the soil microbes will get the nutrients before the plant. They're more efficient. Just like when we get sick, the pathogens and the bad stuff in us gets the sugar before we do. And the same happens in the soil because they're just more efficient than the plant. That's why I wanted to introduce the soil conditioning index. Many of you probably are familiar with it. It's a trend indicator. Based on that cropping system that includes high carbon and low carbon crops, what is the trend of my soil organic matter? Again, it's not the only test in the world. It may not even be the best, but I can do it on millions of acres. I can definitely do it at a farm field level in under an hour. I don't have to send anything to the lab. So I'm suggesting that there's a mix here. Understand the carbon, high carbon and low carbon crops in a rotation. Understand what the soil conditioning index trend is. What is that value? What is my trend? Don't get hung up on an exact number. If that soil conditioning index is greater than 0.5 or close to 1, I have a strong trend. Couple that with, there's a lot of excellent in-field soil health tests that you can do for carbon, all types of labile, non-labile, all types of the soil carbon fractions, depending on how interested or progressive your client wants to become with the soil carbon. So look at that cropping system, get that SCI value, then if those things are, whatever those values are, you can approach the farmer and see, do we want to look further and do more testing? And whenever you do a soil sample, get an organic matter test done. It's not that much more money, and it can be quite informative.
Okay, in the interest of time, I'd like to wrap up the Q&A. I want to thank you again, Justin, for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your work.
Thank you, Julia.
At this time, I want to recognize our Premier Ag Retailer members, the Andersons, a Gold member, and Silver members, Gertie Ag and Nutrient Ag Solutions. Their contribution helped make this webinar possible and help promote the strides that ag retailers are making to reduce nutrient impairments. For more information on membership, contact our project manager at caitlin@partnershipfarm.org or visit our website and click Become a Member to fill out our online form. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge additional funders and collaborators that made this webinar possible, in particular, Field to Market, the McKnight Foundation, and the Great Lakes Protection Fund. If you are interested in sponsoring future webinars, please contact our project manager at caitlin@partnershipfarm.org or visit our website. As we wrap up, please remember to look for the follow-up email in a few days with 2 webinar evaluations and a webinar recording. If you submitted your CCA number at registration and are viewing this webinar live or the recording within 2 weeks of the original date, your CEUs will be automatically submitted. Only if you are watching the recording more than 2 weeks after the original broadcast date will you need to email julia@partnershipfarm.org your CCA number to ensure your CEUs are submitted. One last reminder to please take both webinar evaluations. There is the usual PARM webinar evaluation form, as well as an evaluation form from the USDA Midwest Climate Hub. Both links to the surveys are provided on this slide and will also be emailed to all registrants in a few days. I want to thank you all again for joining us today, and I hope you join us again for our next webinar in August.